In this video, we will be deploying Databricks Asset Bundles using Azure DevOps Pipelines. This means our code will be in an Azure DevOps repo and will be deployed in our Databricks workspace. So I'm basing this video on a blog article I wrote about a week ago, and we're using several components. So to follow along in this video, you will need an Azure DevOps repository with the code, and you will need an account in a Databricks Free Edition workspace. Finally, if you want to follow along, all the code that I will show and discuss today will be shared on this public GitHub repository that will be linked in the comments below. So for now, let's get started. The link to this article will also be placed under the video, and it basically details step by step what we will do in the video. Before we begin, let's talk about the use case itself. So we are deploying Databricks resources that are defined in a Databricks Asset Bundle, or a DAB in short, from a Git repository that's hosted on Azure DevOps. So even though the code I share is in GitHub, if you want to use it Azure DevOps Pipeline, your code would have to be on Azure DevOps. So there's a couple important points that we will learn. First of all, before we can use Databricks in Azure DevOps, we would have to authenticate the Databricks workspace to permit it to access our code in our Azure DevOps Git repository. We'll finally see how we can define a simple Databricks Asset Bundle file that basically creates a Databricks job consisting of one notebook task. And this notebook task prints a value that we will pass through a notebook widget. And more interestingly, this parameter value that we will pass will come from our Databricks Asset Bundle file. This means that this value can be different for the various targets in a Databricks Asset Bundle file, as we will see later. Now, a potential use case of why you may want to do this is if, for example, you have an Azure Key Vault for each environment, development, test, and production that has different value. In that case, you can define this value in your Databricks Asset Bundle file. And finally, once we have this DAB finished, we will deploy it once locally by first validating the DAB and then deploying it to our free workspace manually over the Databricks CLI. And once that's working, we will build an Azure DevOps pipeline that will automate this process for us and will redeploy our resources on every commit or PR merge on the main branch. In the end, we will have a working Azure DevOps pipeline that will deploy our Databricks resources inside our free Databricks environment. So let's have a look at how the project on GitHub is structured. There's a README with some documentation that you can read. And the three main components are the demo notebook, which consists of a bit of code just to print a value coming from a widget. We have our databricks.yaml file, which is our DAB, our Databricks Asset Bundle. And finally, in the third step, we will write our Azure DevOps Pipeline.yaml file, which will create a pipeline on Azure DevOps that will deploy this DAB in a Databricks workspace. There's a couple things we'll have to do first. Like I mentioned, you have to grant access to Databricks from Databricks to Azure DevOps, but also in the reverse, we would have to grant the pipeline later access to our Databricks environment to deploy it there. But before we begin, let's have a look at a notebook. I have the notebook here in my GitHub repository, and it really consists of only one cell where we have 2 lines of code. We read a value from our Databricks widgets, which in this case is just a text widget with the name demo parameter, and then prints this value to stand it out. That's it, so nothing fancy. The second file, second part we will now look at would be the Databricks Asset Bundle itself and how we defined it. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the workflow we are going to deploy consists of having one Databricks job. And this Databricks job, all it does, it runs the notebook we just saw. So it should read the value from the parameter and then print it. Now, let's look at the code of our Databricks Asset Bundle itself. As mentioned earlier, it's located in our databricks.yaml file, and it's not too long, and we can view it on my article here. It's a bit more readable. You can see that we define our bundle, give it a unique ID, a name. And the more interesting part is that we also, at the root level, define two variables for the Databricks Asset Bundle. We define our Git branch, give it a description, and also the demo parameter value. Now, this demo parameter value is the value that will be assigned to our notebook widget here, and that will be read by this line of code. Note that this is not the value, this is just a declaration of the variable. The actual setting of the variables will be done below. Here I just give the tag application, demo notebook, to this workflow, to this job in Databricks. And here we define our targets. Now the targets in a Databricks Asset Bundle are essentially the Databricks workspaces in which you want to deploy your Databricks assets. Given that we use the free Databricks environment, means that we are limited to only one workspace, which is why in my code here, I call this target free. Normally in a real production environment, you would have a target dev, a target test, and a target prod for your development, testing, and production environments, respectively. We will treat our environment, so our Databricks workspace, as a development workspace. This means that DAGs are not automatically scheduled and means a couple of other things. Here in the host, we specify the URL to our free Databricks workspace. This will be different for you. You can basically get yours by just copying this URL from the .com all the way back to the HTTPS. Okay, now that we have that, we define the variables now. So we now give them a value. Remember, we earlier defined the variables git branch and demo parameter value. Well, it's over here in the target section that we actually assign a value to them. So we want to print out hello world. This will be our demo parameter value. And the git branch main will be important later. As we will see in the DevOps pipeline on Azure, we want to deploy whenever we have a change on the main branch. And for example, if you would have a second environment, development or test, your git branch could be test or dev, in which case the pipeline would only trigger if a commit is made on that specific branch. Right, so now that we have defined our variables and our targets, we can go on and define our actual Databricks Asset Bundle resources. We will deploy essentially one job. The job will be called Run Demo Notebook Job. It consists of only one task, as you can see here. It's a notebook task with the name Run Demo Notebook. And here we specify that the path of the notebook will be Demo Notebook. That's because it's in the root of the repository. It's on the same level as our Databricks Asset Bundle file. And this base parameters is important. The base parameters are essentially the widgets that you define for your Databricks notebook. So when this notebook will be ran by our job, the job itself will create the correct widget that will be read by this code here, by the first line, demo parameter. And here we see that we actually assign the value to this demo parameter from the variables here. So we have a variable from our environment free that will be read here. Now this is important. Why didn't we just define the hello world on this line? Well, because we have the same job, most likely in multiple environments, and which is why we would have to read it from a variable. Now we know that if, for example, the target changes to production or to test, we can still get the correct value for the target from this variable. This syntax is essentially how you specify variables in Databricks Asset Bundle file. A couple more important things. We will read the notebook not by uploading it manually to from a Databricks workspace, for example, from our folder here. No, instead we will read the latest version of the notebook from Git itself, which is why we indicate source Git here. And we specify the Git source to be the URL to your Azure DevOps repository. The provider will be Azure DevOps, of course. And here again, we specify which branch to use. This was the second parameter we defined for our workflow. So again, this will be the main branch for our free workspace because I only have one workspace. But if you would have development, testing, and production, you could have something like the develop branch, test branch, and then the main branch for production. Finally, we see that we define a schedule for our Databricks job that will run daily at 7 a.m. UTC. It will not be enabled automatically because, as we saw earlier, we deploy in mode development. All right, so now that we have our notebook written, we have our Databricks Asset Bundle defined, we would now like to allow Databricks to pull code from Azure DevOps repositories. That's important because, as we said earlier, the code for our job or for our notebook task will not come from Databricks. It will be pulled from Azure DevOps. So we have to give Databricks permission to pull this code from Azure DevOps repo. And that's what we will do in the next part. All right, to authorize Databricks to pull code from our Azure DevOps repo, we have to create a personal access token in Azure DevOps and then use this token in our Databricks workspace to authorize Databricks. So for this, we'll first create the path, navigate to your Azure DevOps UI, go to user settings, and then on personal access tokens. We will create a new token, which I will call Databricks. And instead of giving it full access to our repository, which it doesn't need, it's always a good practice to give it the most minimal amount of permissions. In this case, there's no work items we need to consider. We do want the token to authorize reading code, but not writing code, and definitely not managing it. And the build is also something that we do not need. So that would be sufficient. I'll give it an expiration time of 30 days. You can probably put it a bit longer if you want to use it longer. So go ahead and create. And here it would create the value that you would need to copy, because this value we will now use in our Databricks workspace under your user settings, and then under linked accounts, we can add a Git integration by adding a Git credential. The provider in this case will not be GitHub, it will be Azure DevOps. That's where our code is stored. The nickname, I'm going to keep the default value, and the username or email will have to be the email that is registered with your Azure DevOps account. So I've done that. And finally, paste the secret value of the of the Azure DevOps personal access token here into the token field. All right, we can save that. The token is active. So technically, we can now deploy our Databricks resources defined in our DApp to our Databricks workspace manually. So for this, we will use the Databricks CLI, which is essentially just a terminal window. It's a terminal interface. So what you would first like to do is see, if you haven't authenticated yet, is to authenticate with your profile name. In my case, I've named it free. You would probably see a browser showing you that you're authenticated. So now we can return to our terminal window, and in the repository where we have our code, remember we had the Databricks Asset Bundle here. We have our notebook, and what we are doing now is we are validating the Databricks YAML file with the following command: Databricks bundle validate, where you specify the target in that DAB file that you want to validate. In our case, we only have one target free, so I specify that one. And we see that, the validation passed, so we are now ready to deploy. Before I do that, however, let me show you quickly that under jobs and pipelines, I currently have nothing defined. So in essence, I have an empty Databricks workspace. However, now if I would run Databricks bundle deploy to the free target, we hope to see our Databricks job there in a moment. So the deployment already completed. Now if I go back to my Databricks jobs, I see now that I have this run demo notebook job that we defined and discussed earlier. It's a job. We see that the tags have been set to demo notebook as application, and our trigger is paused by default because we had, as you remember, mode development activated. So let's just go ahead and first inspect the task. We have, first of all, we use serverless compute because we didn't specify a particular compute resource in our DAB. The schedule is 7 a.m. in the morning. We pull our code from our GitHub repository from the main branch. And I think one important thing to note is that the parameters are defined on the job level. So let's go ahead and look at the tasks. We see that we have one demo notebook task. And let's go ahead and execute this one. So we can go back to our jobs and pipelines, click on play, and view the run. The run shouldn't take more than 20 seconds. So let's have a look. And here you see that when we run the task, we have a demo parameter as a base parameter to our notebook with the value hello world that we will read with this code and print the value. And we see that indeed we have the value hello world that we defined in our Databricks asset bundle over here for this particular target. If we would deploy to a different workspace, we could have used a different value while still keeping these resources the same, because the value from this parameter is read via this $ curly braces syntax. Okay, and finally, in the final part of the video, now that we have deployed our DAB manually, we can now write a Azure DevOps pipeline. All right, next we automate the manual deployment we did using the Databricks CLI by running the same commands in a Azure DevOps pipeline. So for this, we have to create a third file. This would be the Azure DevOps Pipeline YAML file in the public GitHub repository. It will contain the following code that I will go over now in detail. We want the pipeline to trigger each time we have a commit on the main branch. And the three files that will be involved in the deployment will be the demo notebook file, the Databricks YAML file, and the Azure DevOps Pipeline file. This means that whenever one of these three files is updated on the main branch, the workflow will run. There is only one job that we define, namely the deploy free job. And it will only trigger if we have this condition is met. So whenever a change is made on the main branch. Note that if you would have multiple branches, we could have multiple jobs. But in this case, this will only run on the main branch. The next point is quite important. Here we define a variable, or better, that would be a variable group. And this variable group will store two important environment variables for this particular job. And what do I mean by this? For this, let's first look at our three tasks. So we will have three tasks in this pipeline. The first one installs the Databricks CLI via this command. Now we have already, we didn't explicitly install the CLI in the previous step, but because this pipeline will run on a new agent every time, we have to reinstall the CLI. And the second two steps you are more familiar with because we ran them manually in the previous part. It's the Databricks bundle validate and Databricks bundle deploy commands, respectively. Except that in this case, we also have to export an environment variable called Databricks token. And here we will also basically specify the target of our deployment using an environment variable. And it's these two environment variables that we will store in our variable group called Databricks Free Variable Group. Now, why is this necessary? Why can't we use browser identification like we did in the previous step? Well, we can't because the entity running this pipeline is not human. It's an agent. So it's a machine, which is why we will pass a Databricks token. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Let's now first create these two environment variables. For this, we will navigate to our pipelines, and in the library section, let's create a new variable group. I will use the same name that I've used in the pipeline. So let's copy this, and we can create a variable group name here and save it. Well, yeah, we first have to add some environment variables. So let's first add the Databricks workspace environment variable. That one we already know. This will simply have the value 3, which is not a secret value. Now, the second value that we will have to add is called the Databricks token, which we will create in a moment. All right. Now let's look at why we need the Databricks token. In the previous part, we had to authorize Databricks to pull code from Azure DevOps repos, whereas now we have to authorize the opposite direction. We have Azure DevOps Pipelines that want to deploy Databricks assets in our Databricks workspace, which means that this time we have to authorize Azure DevOps to connect and do things in our Databricks workspace, which is why in this case we will create a personal access token in Databricks. For this, go to click on your user, go to settings, and under developer you will see a field with access tokens. Let's click on manage, and we will generate a new token. This token will be used for Azure DevOps Pipelines, for instance, with a lifetime of 90 days. Now, of course, now you see my super secret value of my token, but by the time I have uploaded this video on YouTube, this token will have been deleted anyway. So copy this value and return to your variable group that we are defining and paste it in your Databricks token field, but make sure to hide this value because it's secret. So now we can save this variable group, and this variable group's environment variables, Databricks token and Databricks workspace, can now be used in our Azure DevOps pipeline by referring to them between these round braces and a $sign. So just to go over the pipeline one more time, we define our variable group, install the Databricks CLI via this command. We will validate our Databricks Asset Bundle the same way we did locally. And finally, if this step passes, we will deploy our Databricks Asset Bundle to our specified target. And we obtain the Databricks personal access token from the environment variable, and the same with the workspace. We make a variable for the workspace because we may want to rerun this job for different branches and different targets without having to re-specify a new job. So we can reuse this job for however many environments and branches we have. Okay, so that seems to work. Now that we have this defined, we can go to our Azure DevOps Pipeline section and we will create a pipeline. Make sure you actually have your Azure DevOps Pipelines.yaml file in your repos here, because this file will then be used to create a pipeline as we will do now. So now I create on create pipeline. Yeah, sure, let's do that. And we will use a pipeline from our Git repository. We can filter this repository that I have, and we will create an existing Azure DevOps Pipelines YAML file because we have already written it. And we see that we have it here in our repo that we can use. We click on continue. We see that the code has been imported. It looks the same as we have in the article. And now we can click on run, but before it will allow us to run the pipeline, it will ask us to authorize it, because the pipeline needs permission to access the resources. Let's look what it needs. And indeed, it needs our permission to use the Databricks free variable group containing our two environment variables. So let's grant this permission to our pipeline. Permit. The permission is granted. So now if we observe our pipeline, we see that it's initializing the job. It has checked out the code. Step 1 is completed. The DAB is validated. So now our pipeline proceeds to deploying our asset bundle. This shouldn't take more than a couple of seconds, and it's complete. So now our pipeline ran, which means that we now expect to find the deployed resources in our job tab in Databricks. And given that we already had one resource here created, I can go ahead and delete the job and rerun the pipeline one more time to make sure that we actually generate the Databricks assets. Let's look at the pipeline run again. So it's restarting. It's currently queued. All right, there we go. It's installing the CLI, validating, and finally deploying the bundle to our free target. That has been completed. So now if I look at my jobs, I see that indeed I have recreated the pipeline, this time not from the Databricks CLI manually on my computer, but from our Azure DevOps pipeline. All right, so this is really it for this video. We saw how we created our Databricks Asset Bundle that deploys a job that runs a notebook. This notebook obtains a value from a Databricks notebook widget, whose value is set in our DAB file itself. We saw how we can validate and then deploy this DAB manually using the Databricks CLI. And in the last step, we finally saw how to automate this process using an Azure DevOps pipeline. That's it for now. And thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.